So without further ado, here is Brandon
What,
Hetzler.
if somebody were to ask you, like, what's the elevator pitch for this project, basically?
Well, I mean,
And by elevator, I mean a couple floors, not,
a couple floors. It's pretty
not,
simple. It's pretty simple. I mean, I think we've been talking about movement for a long time, and
right.
we haven't. We use all these words and we use all these complicated descriptions, and I think all we've done from a movement perspective is complicate things. We've
Mm-hmm.
taken a complex activity of movement, and we've just added further or we've added a layer of complication to that instead of making it complex. We've added, let me rewind, complexity, complication. Movement's complex. We have tried to complicate it too much. And so
Okay.
my goal with the New Language of Movement series was to reverse that, look at movement from a completely different perspective, take away all of the exercise terms that we've used that lend to this confusion that, when I say lunge, no matter what I'm talking about, you've already got a preconceived notion about what I'm doing.
Right.
And what we've done with this is we've tried to go back and create a language that actually is based off of movement and not off of exercise.
Okay.
Because when I say deadlift, depending on your background, you're going to think of something that may or may not be anywhere close to what I'm talking about. And in the last few years, when as human development and the understanding of human development has improved and increased and has introduced and worked its way into movement practice, we've tried to take an old language and mix that in there. And I think all that's done is, add to that complication. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to simplify things, even though my butchering of complexity and complication aren't selling that. We've tried to simplify things and start from scratch with a language that flows out of movement to describe exercise instead of trying to use exercise to describe movement.
Okay. Awesome. And that does come across. I just like to hear it from the source. I was thinking, can we take a brief walk through the neurodevelopmental continuum and
Yeah.
address, just briefly, we can just highlight each posture,
Mm-hmm.
each pattern, and then oh, I'm going to butcher it, sorry, but the neurodevelopmental strength progression, the NSP, right?
The NSP, yes.
So maybe we can just tie that in a little bit too, as far as where those. And one thing that you really, this is where maybe a little bit of confusion comes in. I don't want the listener to get confused, but you do highlight that you change it to a continuum because you don't want people to think of it as like an all or nothing.
Correct.
Where it's like, once you did this, now this happens. There are certain things like you'll talk about right now where this will be the first time you see this start to occur in development, but that does not make it isolated, nor should it be that once you're past that, there's no use for that, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Correct.
okay, so let's start at supine since we got to start at the beginning. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, and also, if you look at how we first started to describe what we at the time were calling neural developmental sequence, it was slightly different than what we were trying to do now, and how we're describing it now. We realized probably 2-3 years ago that, within that neural developmental sequence, there were two distinct paths that you went down. The path that was posture based, and then the paths that were pattern, or the path that was pattern based. So we were able to separate it out and when we looked at it and started classifying it, it broke down into 6 postures and surprisingly 6 patterns. And from a pattern standpoint, supine is that first pattern. It's a flexion dominated pattern. We typically, it's basically somebody laying down on their back. That's how, when babies are born, they're in a systemically flexed posture. We're born flexed, and supine is essentially the posture of flexion. We I don't want to say the next posture, because really, you could make the argument that prone and supine together develop together. They're really more the fundamental postures more than anything else. But prone is the opposite of that. Prone is where we see extension develop. That's laying down on your belly. Gravity.
tummy time.
Yeah, tummy time.
Tummy
Yeah,
time.
gravity starts to push us into full hip extension. It helps the spine develop its secondary curves. We have to lift the head up off the ground, which helps us develop our cervical curvature in the spine. And then most importantly, in prone is where we actually see our first introduction of actual purposeful strength, where we're pushing down into the ground and lifting our head up off the ground. And like my recent Facebook series of what the first expression of strength is, that upper body extension is what becomes our cornerstone for all further strength development, because that is our first introduction to strength. And like we've talked about, you can't separate movement development from strength development. They develop hand in hand with each other. And so as we see that upper body extension strength developing in prone, what then happens is we move up into a quadruped posture where the trunk is up off the ground. We're supported fully on our hands, our knees, and our feet. The ground no longer is providing any kind of stability for us. We're having to program that motor control and work things out. A little bit more of an unstable environment. Our center of mass is up a little bit higher. Quadruped became quite popular a few years ago with a lot of the crawling that was taking place. I do think crawling,
yes,
I do think crawling has its benefits and it is pretty amazing. But depending on what author you read and what research you read, quadruped is actually the newest addition to the neurodevelopmental continuum that really some people don't think existed prior to 200 years ago. Which once we started looking at it like that, where sitting, another neurodevelopment, another posture that's within the continuum, with sitting and quadruped being interchangeable, if you look at what develops in quadruped and if you look at what develops in sitting, they ultimately end up developing the same thing. So it's almost like two paths that end up at the same place.
And you do cite that in the movement restoration book. You talk specifically about that research that showed that I believe you related it that the woman that did the research showed that the quadruped developed in more developed countries that had a safe ground environment, whereas if you were on possibly precarious terrain, you would be in a sitting posture. Those same skills. Yeah,
and there's actually some later in the day already, so some of my fancy words I'm forgetting them, but I remember this one. There's actually some pockets of indigenous populations still today where when they go in and they observe, their children don't get down in quadruped at all, because just like you said, putting those babies on the ground, there's threats to those babies. And so if they put them on the ground, they're on some kind of, make some kind of mat out of leaves or something like that, and they put them in that seated posture. But all the same things develop out of sitting that we see develop in quadruped. They truly are pretty much interchangeable. Both develop trunk stability. Quadruped develops freedom in the hands to interact with the environment. Quadruped, the one thing that is a little bit unique about quadruped is it opens the door to locomotion, but you can also see locomotion take place in the sitting with the scooting and the pushing, which if you think about that, the amount of midline control and the amount of trunk stability that develops from having to push the hands down into the ground and scoot away, we see a high level of that develop in sitting that we can't get the same type of stability out of quadruped. From the sitting posture, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and instinctually, you've touched on this in the books too, that not that you can call it really a motivation, but let's say the genetic drive to do all this is really to, explore the environment, start to interact with the environment?
I mean, again, I'll go back to my recent Facebook post. One of the questions, when I first posed the question, what's the first expression of strength, and then gave the options. One of the options they gave was core strength, and somebody answered right. Core strength, and the reason they gave was you have to have a strong trunk to branch away from. So they started referencing a tree, and so the question I asked was, okay, that's great, but what holds that tree to the ground? Mm-hmm. Obviously the roots do. So without the roots, we can't have a strong trunk. But I wasn't trying to set up the answer, making it look like it was a lower body answer. So I went back a little bit further to the question of, okay, now we have that tree that's going to turn into the seed. What is the stimulating and driving force that causes that seed to sprout? And it's that drive it is the environment around it. It's the sensations in that environment, and ultimately what that seed's trying to do is get to the sunlight. Light is what stimulates that growth, and that's what stimulates that seed to grow, and then it has to interact with the environment and everything else. So from a movement standpoint, the entire goal of the neurodevelopmental continuum is to get as much quality sensory input as possible. And the whole, one of the most important parts of the developmental continuum is when we are able to free those hands up. Because as soon as those hands come up off the ground and are no longer required to support us and provide stability, now we're not just a passive participant in our environment. We can actively participate in our environment. We can grab things, pull things to us, and actually interact with what's going on around us. And then from there, it's just a matter of now moving on up to where I can now interact with the environment, but now I also have the freedom and the ability to get from point A to point B to get whatever that shiny object across the room was. So movement is completely motivated and driven by the desire to get better sensory input. Then, from the sitting postures, we go into our kneeling postures, and really, there's tons of different kneeling postures. The hallmark of a kneeling posture is the hips aren't on the ground. They're supported either, they're off the ground, either they're resting on the back of the heels, they're resting on the back of one heel, or they're up in what we call a tall kneeling position, where we're in more of a full hip extended position or a half kneeling position. There's tons of asymmetrical kneeling postures. I think the one of the most popular ones that we see is half kneeling. But if half kneeling is the only kneeling variation that you're doing, it's like only being able to play one musical note. You can make that note sound good, but you can't play any songs. And then also, the thing that often gets missed with our kneeling postures is, mobility does precede stability. So kneeling starts actually down on the ground in the short kneeling postures, where we're leveraging, full ankle plantar flexion, full ankle dorsiflexion, full knee flexion. There's actually some studies out there that look at range of motion requirements, and actually some of the kneeling variations require more and larger range of motions at the knee, the hip, and the ankle than squatting does. So, and if you look at Western population, we don't spend a whole lot of time in any kind of kneeling populations. But if you look at the rest of the world, they spend quite a bit of time in different kneeling postures due to religious practices, due to how their homes are set up, spending more time on the floor. And all of these studies we're looking at and driven by the need and the desire to find better hardware for total knee and total hip replacements, because the hardware out there didn't accommodate the range of motion that the rest of the world needed. So we're finding that actually kneeling has a very large mobility component to it that we often miss when we just jump straight into half kneeling. Kneeling's also where we really begin to see the development of a lot of that asymmetrical stuff that we talked about in volume 3. The asymmetrical strategies. We really are able to start splitting up left side and right side once we get to kneeling. From kneeling, we go into stance, and in stance, we have our three variations of that: our symmetrical stance, our asymmetrical stance, and then what we'd often refer to as single leg stance. But volume 4, a little teaser for volume 4 that's in process. I also now believe that single leg stance isn't actually a correct terminology. We look at it now.
Wow, okay.
We look at it now as more of a single leg transition. And just a question I'll ask for you to think about on that is, outside of seeing that personal trainer or that physical therapist or that strength coach asking an athlete to stand on one leg and do a squat, or stand on one leg and catch this ball when they're on the RX pad, when was the last time you saw somebody stand on one leg to do anything?
Right.
If you look at where we see single leg stance during normal everyday life, it's to connect asymmetrical stance on the left side, asymmetrical stance on the right side. We do it slow, it's called walking. We do it fast, it's called running. There's not too many times where we spend any amount of time actually in a single leg stance without connecting asymmetrical stance on one side, asymmetrical stance on the other. So volume 4 is going to get in and bust all the common thought on what actual single leg training should be, how it should be, and why it's not bad, but how we can make it a little bit better. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, because it seems like even like the best, just touching on that real quick, it seems like the best strategies around that is to try to get some stability in the end range of motion, and then trying to reincorporate it back into the like overall goal.
Yeah.
Of whatever it is that you're trying to work on. So within that, let's just touch on each pattern real quick. So breathing, head control, pushing down, we touched on. Weight shift, perturbations.
Perturbations.
Yeah. But that one, I get it mentally, but when it comes out, I sound pretty ignorant. So.
It does. Well, we like using the big words.
For saying limb movement, right?
Yeah, yes. It'd be too easy to say that. This is when we realized that we've known for a long time that breathing was important, but we didn't really understand. I don't think we fully grasp how important breathing is, and I don't think we fully grasp or do a good job of integrating breathing into anything else that we do.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of really good breathing workshops out there, and I don't want to take away from anything that they're doing, but I think the one thing that, if you could classify what happens in a lot of those breathing workshops, it's a lot of stuff that's ground based, and then they do a lot of stuff that's standing based. Well, what about everything in the middle? Breathing essentially, one of the questions we always got within our graduate program is, well, when do I know that it's time to progress to a higher posture? And one of our answers, well, when you can breathe in that posture. Now we're starting to check the boxes. It's time to progress. So breathing really is the foundation of all stability. If you can't breathe in a posture, forget everything else that's going to happen from there. And not saying that you have to be able to diaphragmatically breathe all the time, because, breathing is ultimately going to be very contextual. But just like I said before in in all of the books, because I just copy and paste that section, if you've truly mastered a strategy, you can display and express that strategy in any context under any situation. So if you've truly mastered the strategy of breathing, I can switch from diaphragmatic breathing to being a chest breather to breathing to get through that 5K race I'm trying to do. And as soon as it's over, switch right back to the diaphragmatic breathing. I can control which style of breathing I'm using based off of what's going on in the context of the situation. It's when you can't control that, and when you only have one breathing strategy that things really become a problem. After, and really when that newborn's brought into the world, that's about one of the only things they can do is breathe. So from breathing and from a flexed posture, essentially everything else develops and moves forward. Head control, being able to control the head and then being able to move the head, two completely different things. Two completely different strategies, regardless of which posture we're talking about, whether we're talking about prone, supine, any of the kneeling postures, we've got to have that head where it needs to be, because we know where the head goes, the body follows. So we have to be able to position that head appropriately within each posture. Both breathing and head control sound easy until somebody can't do them, and then it's a completely different experience. Down, if I had to classify which one I thought was the most powerful out of all of the patterns, I would say it's pushing down, because that's really, the magic behind, or not the magic, but the wizard behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. That's really where pushing down comes in, because a lot of the what the hell effects and a lot of the, hey, let me do this and make an amazing results come from pushing down. Pushing down, we're actually exerting force into the ground or into the implement that we're lifting. And when we do that, one of the laws of physics tells us that we're going to get an equal and opposite reaction, which is then what causes that, reflex stabilization of the midline of the trunk of all those little stabilizer muscles. But it comes from that ability to push down and effectively utilize those ground reaction forces. It's one of those, though, that if you see... Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say... go ahead and finish your thought. Well, I was just going to say, now, the thing with pushing down is if you see movement taking place, you've moved out of the pushing down world. You've moved into a weight shift. So when we're actually
Okay.
pushing
That makes
down,
a lot of sense.
it's one of those you don't see it happening, but you feel it. And it's one of
Right.
those that when you set it up right and get people to do this, you can challenge them to try and resist it, but they can't. No matter what, those muscles are
Hmm.
going to turn on because the body's reacting to those ground reaction forces that we're creating.
Okay. So while we're on the topic of pushing down, I'm curious, whether it's in performance or rehab training, do you guys have a role for like destabilizing um, balance as far as like using a BOSU or an RX pad or something like that?
You saw my Juvo board video, didn't you?
I saw that one, but then there's also been people, and we don't need to name names right now, but there's been people who you've collaborated with and you're close to, and there's been, it's always like a back and forth, right? You have a statement, then you have a reaction, then you have a reaction to reaction, and so in this in the strong first strength world, and it seems like even in FMS a lot, there was like hey, you need to be able to root, you need to be stable on the ground. That's what, again, you're going to be able to generate these forces, you're going to generate control. And then, then people have chimed in, hey, there's times and places to use these things. Don't judge other people when you're using them. Me being a little arrogant, I think I do tend to judge when I see certain exercises being performed, and I think that I understand the strategy and I don't agree with it. But that being said, there is a time and a place for every tool. So I'm just curious what applications you're seeing that you could say, yes, that's the right application of trying to use that modality.
So when it comes to any of the instability stuff,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely a time and a place that can be very effective. And I think that time and place is determined less by marketing and more by the person in front of you. But unfortunately, I think right now marketing determines when a lot of that stuff gets used because, balancing on an RX or doing swings on a BOSU look really, really cool compared to doing swings on the ground. But
Right.
in all of the people that I have taught how to do kettlebell swings and all the many thousands of kettlebell swings I've done myself and all of the hours and hours of people I've stood and watched, do swings, never once have I had that thought come across my mind, hey, you're good enough with swings that I need to put you on a BOSU ball.
Right.
Because if you look at what we're trying to create out of a swing, explosiveness, the ability to control a weight, never once have I thought, you know what, if I put them on an unstable surface, it's going to make it better. Um, I if that is, if balance truly is the person's highest priority and they do an amazing job at balancing on a stable surface, then and only then I might consider putting them on some kind of unstable surface. But that would be the only time.
Right.
Now I did. It's interesting you asked this. 2 months ago, I was asked to shoot a video, a workout video for a local company called Stamina that manufactures what's called a Juvo board. It's basically a land-based version of a stand-up paddleboard, and put together a video. And as soon as I posted that video, one of your former coworkers called me out. Hey, why are you teaching people training on unstable surfaces? Doesn't that violate everything that you've talked about with movement restoration, movement outlaws? And so then I asked her, I'm like, hey, why don't you post that online? Let me answer that online. And she did. It was actually a really good question. And I knew I was going to get that question because I was doing stuff on an unstable surface, which is something that I've been adamantly opposed to. But if you actually watch that video and watch the progression that I go through with that, very little of what I do is actually in a completely unstable environment. After that video shoot, talking with the people that did the video and manufactured the board, we're actually in discussions about doing several other videos because some of the stuff I showed them, they're like, we'd never even thought to use the board this way. Because a lot of what I did, one of the things I did was I did a push-up. But I did a push-up where my left hand was on the ground and my right hand was up on the board. So I had a little bit of an unstable surface, but I also had a very stable surface on the ground. And so I was having to control and work out that weight shift and create a new strategy in the presence of that. So it wasn't a fully unstable surface. And then at the end, I did one or two drills actually all the way up on the board. But kind of what I wanted to highlight with that was a progression from stable to unstable while still honoring that developmental continuum, because I did the same thing. I started down on prone, worked to quadruped, into some kneeling postures, and all the way up to stance. Again, working through stable to unstable while utilizing the board. So I do think it has its place, but I also think that fully unstable training, that place is very limited, and the people that are going to benefit from that are very few and far between.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Again, the right modality, the right
happiness, and I know everything that's shining always gonna be gold. I'll be fine once I get it. I'll be good.
We gotta make a change. It's time for us as a people to start making some changes. Let's change the way we eat, let's change the way we live, and let's change the way we treat each other. You see, the old way wasn't working, so it's on us to do what we gotta do.